Well, good evening. It's good to see everyone here tonight. Mark just gave me a bit of an update on Stephen and Kaylee. The doctor had just come in. He just got off the phone. Mark just got off the phone with Jeff. The doctor just came in. They haven't done anything yet. They've been waiting all day. And now that the doctor's in, there will probably be another test, and then there will probably be a birth. So just an update there on that. With that being said, we are continuing forward in Ephesians chapter 5. If you were not with us last week, we finished the first half of chapter 5 as we looked at this idea once again of transforming the way that we walk and letting go of some things, not getting drunk with wine, but being filled with the Spirit. And we saw how there's a major communal and private aspect as an individual, but there's also a communal aspect as we see in verse 13 and 14, moving in to verse 15. And then we spent some time talking about what verse 19 might mean, or rather how that applies, why it applies to us and to our worship service. And then we spent some time in verses 22 through 24, looking at the idea, it says in verse 22, wives be subject to your own husbands as for the Lord. Starting in verse 22, we transition in the chapter to focusing more on this sort of family structure. We've talked about unity in service as well as how one ought to walk with one another. And then we're moving from sort of the big into a smaller version of submission where we look at the family unit. And we see this idea starting with wives being subject or in submission or in subjection more accurately to their husbands. And we spent some time looking at that idea of subjection. And the point was raised last week that everyone is subject to something, in that it's not that husbands don't have anything that they're not subject to, and it doesn't mean that we all, when we come to church, are not subject to Christ. But there is a certain, we all have something that we are subject to, and we also made the point that if we cannot subject ourselves to the worldly authorities, it becomes that much harder to do what? Exactly, subject ourselves to spiritual authority or to subject ourselves to Christ. And so tonight we're going to try and finish out chapter 5 and move into chapter 6, but we're still going to, no matter where we end tonight, we're still going to be talking about these family relationships. But they're going to be couched, and it was kind of mentioned last week that there is a point to all this. It's not just about Paul wanting to harp exclusively on the structure of the family unit, but there's a larger point that is being pushed towards by Paul that he wants to make. Let's see. Nolan Papillon, would you mind reading for me verses 25 through 33, please? Through 33, please. Thank you. So I want to start a little bit backwards as we sort of break this down. I want us to start at the end, looking at verses 30, 31, and 32. What is Paul's point in bringing up this whole family structure? Is it just because Paul wants to give instructions on how one is supposed to work within the family, what one's role is within the family, or is there something else according to verses 30 through 32? Right, it's an analogy of how the church works, but it's pointing towards that relationship of the church and Christ. Ian? Mm-hmm. Exactly. There, as Ian just said, to summarize what he said, if you couldn't hear that, that there is a pattern here that is being shown in Christ's relationship to the church. We can understand how Christ truly relates to us as part of the body by understanding and looking at the family, how the husband ought to be in the family. Christ exemplifies and epitomizes what that is supposed to look like, so that there's not only a reflection of how Christ is in the church, in the family unit, but there's also, more importantly, an understanding of how husbands ought to act towards their wives, because we see truly what sacrifice looks like for those that one loves through Christ, as Christ gave up himself for the church, really for all mankind, but for the church that he is the head of, and that he is priest and king and all those things we see in Hebrews. And it's a very good point in summarizing this, is that Paul is bringing this up for us to understand, most importantly, Christ's role within the church, in that he is the head. We are the bride as the body, and he is the head over us. This is a very old formula that God uses to use something physical. We as man can tangibly understand the reference that Paul makes in verse 31 that goes back to Genesis chapter 3 and the idea of marriage, that two shall become one flesh, that the wife shall leave their family and the husband shall leave his family, and the two shall come together and be one flesh. That's an understandable physical principle, especially for those of you that are married. We understand this. But the spiritual principle of the idea that Christ is head over the church, that he is the authority over the church, is difficult to understand. And not only that, in comparing it to a husband and wife relationship, it shows that Christ is more than just king. Because a king doesn't have the relationship with the subjects that Christ is depicted to have with the church. There's a much deeper bond, a much more intimate bond, if you want to use that word, in that there's a sacrifice, there's a love. Just as a husband would love his wife and a wife her husband, so Christ does towards the church, and then expects that same love from us. Any comments or questions before we move? Nolan?
Understanding that love to be unconditional.
Yes, 100%. It is an unconditional love. In that if we really want to look at the love that Christ showed towards the church, I know we've made this point several times in the past, that is a love that we as human beings do not deserve. We do not deserve that sacrifice from Christ because we are sinners, and what we deserve, according to Romans chapter 6 and verse 23, is death. The wages of sin is death. We have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and therefore what we deserve is an eternal and spiritual death and separation from God. But Christ unconditionally died on the cross for sinners. The church is made up of sinners. It's not made up of holy men and women of the righteous. It's made up of the sinner. And we see that also, Paul makes that point very heavily in 1 Timothy chapter 1. Larry.
I think when he says the last part of the verse, when he talks about that quote, the two become one flesh,
Mm-hmm.
that to me is what Paul is getting at throughout this whole section. And I'm not saying all these things that we're saying are wrong, but I'm saying that we have to put them in perspective. The husband and the bride don't look at each other, each one going, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a sinner. I shouldn't be connected to you. They're one.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow Christ and the church, the people, are one.
Mm-hmm.
They become one. And that's his ultimate point. And the way I read it, in the next verse, he kind of goes, you know something? I've given you this ultimate point. But let's not forget rather the day-to-day example that I gave you, that the husband and wife, that these things do happen in the real world.
Yeah.
But those are the least examples to me of that one of just contemplating that Christ and the church are one.
Mm-hmm.
We're connected. We're one being in that sense.
Yeah.
As a married couple is.
And to take that and build on that, as we all go back to chapter 4, where we have this transition point, and it starts with this idea of unity. There's a unity within the body, but there's also unity in our relationship from Christ to the body, as in one flesh. And I think that's a very good point. And to clarify as well, what was referencing earlier as far as the we do not deserve Christ's sacrifice is not in relationship to him as us in the church, but rather in understanding, the point that I was trying to make was understanding the unconditional love, that that not only was the love not conditional, it was a love that necessarily we did not earn in any way. But but back to your point, Larry, when it comes to the relationship with the church, there is supposed to be no deviation. It is supposed to be unified and supposed to be as we are one with Christ, seeking after him and following his example or walk, as we've used several times in the last couple of weeks. But that's a good point. Janine. Exactly. Submitting yourselves to one another for the fear of God, as we see a few verses back in the middle of the chapter. In that, again, is this hearkening back to this larger point that Paul's getting at in this chapter of we have submission to one another, we have submission or subjection to husbands to wives, or excuse me, wives to husband. Don't pull out the pitchforks. Got that backwards. Wives to husband, there is subjection. Husbands are subject to Christ, and all of us in the church are subject to Christ as well. And all of that comes full circle in this chapter. Now, continuing to kind of back up, now that we've sort of understood the whole point that Paul is really getting at in this section, we go back to the husbands in verse 25, looking at verses 25 through 29. And we see that this, when we talk about the relationship of husbands and wives, there is supposed to be what? Husbands are supposed to do what to their wives? Be Uncaring lords with an iron fist? Love them. And, and I think we've already sort of made this point, but I want to hammer this in a little harder, is we use that word love a lot in just our everyday language, right? I love this song. I love, this band, or, I love that movie. We use that word a ton, and we use I love you a lot. I'm not saying it's never used, that it's used disingenuously every time it's used, but it's a word that obviously also has a lot of meanings in the Greek, but it's a word that can sort of get watered down because it is so frequently used. And I think it bears, at least at this point, at this moment, to dwell on it for just a few seconds, because this is Paul's point in the relationship with the husbands, is that love is supposed to be what? There's a certain phrase Paul uses so that husbands can understand the love that they're supposed to have towards their wives. What is that love supposed to be greater than? Say that again, Tyler. Just as Christ loved the church, okay. There we go. That's what I was looking for. More than yourself. And Paul makes that point that in verse 25, husband, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. There's a sacrifice. And then we jump down to verse 28. So husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself, for no one has ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, as Christ also does the church. There is once again hearkening to that idea of being one flesh, both in our relationship with the church and Christ, but also in our relationship with spouses. It's a love that goes deeper than just, okay, I care about this person. Paul's very specific that love is supposed to be sacrificial, not only to the point of death like we see with Christ, but it's supposed to be greater than one's own love for themselves. And I think that is a very important point for us to always remind ourselves of, is that true love of another person, whether this be the more intimate love or the love of a brother in Christ or a sister in Christ, or the more brotherly love, whatever type of love we're referring to, a true aspect of that concept is sacrifice. Is sacrifice of oneself over oneself. Caring about someone much more than you care about your own self, and are willing to make sacrifices for that other person. And again, I think making this point shows us not only how we are supposed to act in relationships and with family, but also in the church, because we're called to the same sort of love as well. Not necessarily as far as the communal aspect of the church aspect, the self-sacrificing love that we're all going to die on a cross for the salvation of sins of the whole world. Obviously, that's not something that we are going to do or even be able to do. But rather that we are all called to this love to have for someone else greater than ourselves. And the biggest impediment to that is what, in your opinion? Selfishness, okay. Anyone else? I think selfishness is a very big impediment. But what about a deeper root than that? Root cause than just selfishness. I think, what'd you say, Arlene? Pride. As really the root of selfishness. Selfishness is a problem, but the root of it, the root attitude, is pridefulness. When we go into a relationship, especially the relationship of marriage, There should be an expectation of humility. If we are going to go into a relationship with another person, and we cannot bring ourselves to have an affection for them and a willingness to put them above ourselves, especially husbands toward their wives, as we're talking contextually here, then there needs to be some serious thinking, in my opinion, of whether or not that marriage should actually take place. If a man is incapable of doing that, and you look in your heart and say, I'm incapable of loving this person more than I love myself, then there is an issue. Because that is not what marriage is supposed to be. There is a direct command. Now, I do think all of us can work on that and improve towards that. And it's clear that that is supposed to be something that we are constantly checking ourselves on. But when it comes to the husband's role in the marriage, he is the one who is not only meant to lead, but he is meant to love. I would argue, and this is something that we see a lot of objection to sort of the godly idea of marriage, is, well, that's giving the husband permission to be a tyrant, to be the ruler of the household. And again, I would go back to this argument, just as we do with Christ. The head of the household is never meant to be a ruler, because rulers most often in monarchies, the problem, there are exceptions to every rule, but the problem with almost every monarchy and every rulership was it was always about the ego and the pride over the subjects. I mean, we can read 1st and 2nd Kings and see so many examples where even good kings, and we'll use the air quotes, the good kings as they're called, struggle sometimes with the fact that they are kings and putting their own subjects' desires ahead of their own. And that's not what I would argue what marriage is ever supposed to be. It's never a rulership as much as it is a role of being the head. And the difference in those two things, and some of you might think, oh, Robert's nitpicking here, or Robert's being very semantical. But I'm not, because the true distinction between being the head and being a ruler when it comes to the family dynamic is that love. Is that willingness to love wives more than them, for husbands to love their wives more than themselves, and to have that sacrificial attitude that Christ has, just as he does in the church. Any comments? Mitch? Yeah.
When there's conflict, when there's disagreement, when there's outright, just times like we work for Christ, defiance, that love just remains. There's no condition on, well, I'm not being treated right, so therefore I have the right to abandon this one.
That's a very good point, Mitch, is that love goes beyond whether or not we, A, feel it reciprocated, and B, whether it's a responsibility that husbands have regardless of what they're receiving in return, regardless if there is not subjection from the wife. It doesn't, in moment to moment, it doesn't matter, because just as comparing that to Christ, his sacrifice was to a people that were in rebellion to him, in defiance to him, and that sets, as you said, a very high standard. I think that's a great point to think about, is understanding that responsibility we have. It's not just if we're, well, I'm going to do what my wife wants because, she'll be nice to me and she'll be, she won't nag me. That's not, and I say that very tongue-in-cheek before I start feeling the daggers thrown at me. It's that's the wrong attitude. The proper attitude would be, I want to do this for my wife because I love her, and this would make her happy, or this would be a good thing for her, even if it means I have to go mow the lawn at 103-degree heat in Bakersfield. It's not fun. But it'll make the wife happy because she likes the lawn looking nice. And that's not just done, again, that should be done because we love her and we like seeing our wives happy. Say our, but anyway. You understand where I'm at on that. Any other comments? Mitch. Or, sorry, Nita. My apologies, I saw a hand and... What I would say that's referring to is verse 31, the idea of how exactly man and woman become one flesh, and that full depth of that idea, because he says, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. That is not the mystery, at least that's how I read it, there's, we're going to there's the flesh, the physical example, but what we're really speaking towards in bringing that up is how Christ and the church are of one flesh, as Larry made the point earlier. Any other comments or questions? Tyler and then Larry.
I find it interesting that both the husband and wife, when you get married, you put your past self behind you. So that sinful, like he gave himself, like his sinful life, he gave it up to be with her, just like you're giving up your sinful life to be with Christ. And then, the washing through, her by the washing with, washing with the water through the word, like every day you guys are with each other, you guys are making each other better. You're cleansing each other, and then it says right here to a point where you guys are with each other so much that you present her. You guys have made each other so much like Christ that you no longer, you present yourselves as radiant. You no longer have stains. Those sins are pushed away. You're living a holy life together. So it's like, you're putting off that, like you said, you're putting off that old self, that sinful life, and being reborn into that marriage with your wife.
I think that's a very interesting point and very, very salient point, that we have that similarity of when we get married, we are casting off our old self and our old life, and we're dedicating our life with that person, saying, I'm going to walk, my life is going to be different because it's now going to be one with you in it, just as we do when we cast off our old life and we repent and turn away from our life of sin and supposed to walk in a new transformed life. And that's a very good point. I did not think of that, of how there's a lot of similarities with marriage there as well. And that the goal of that is that there is supposed to be a betterment of both. And you brought up as well in verse 26, where it talks about the washing of water. We can see almost a direct reference there to when Jesus washes the disciples' feet as a way of sacrifice, as a way of service towards another person, showing that love, willing to get down and sort of disgrace oneself for the service of another person, and in this case, for the service of one's spouse. Larry?
I want to read back to verse 26 also, because I think that explains to me what love is.
Mm-hmm.
Love is something that one learns, that one decides to do. In the world, it's emotion.
Yeah.
But in love as talked about here, why did God love the world? Well, it explains in that next verse 26 that he might sanctify.
Yeah.
He had a goal in mind. And I think that's what they're asking. The difficulty for husband and wife is that we're not Christ, and we don't usually have a goal set in that same way. We're two individuals that decide we're
Mhm.
We hope and pray that the other person will hold to their vows. And you know something? It's a step that I think we overlook and diminish a lot of times because we cannot control the other person.
Yeah.
We often feel like we can, but we cannot control the other person. The other person's going to do whatever they want to do.
Mhm.
And in this case, when both do what they're supposed to do, they become one.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that everybody's going to, has neat thoughts, but it also
Right.
means that everybody is independent. And so here he's defining love as I'm going to sanctify. That is, everything I do in life is going to try to make my spouse, my wife, closer to God.
Yeah.
And I think that's what he's really getting at here. She's going to do in her life trying to bring me closer to God. And so that's the sanctification. And that is, in one sense, the one.
Yeah.
Because that's what you see between Christ and the church.
Yeah. And it's a very good point. The sanctification, bringing one another closer, as that being the goal that Christ had with what he did towards the church. And it's very similar, I think, in many ways to what Tyler was saying as well, that there's an improvement of both. And if we do, I like how you put that, if both are doing what they ought to be doing, it is bringing both closer together to one flesh, and more importantly, bringing each other closer to God. And it's interesting looking at all of this as well as the relationship that we are to have in the church with each other, in relationship in the church to Christ, and understanding how that really does transform every aspect of our lives and how we live with one another. And that's really Paul's point in these last two chapters, is if we take upon Christ, it should have a reverberating effect in every aspect of our lives and every relationship that we have. And it's a choice that we have to make to change. That's the other point that Larry made that was going to be the next point before we ended the chapter, was love is an action word. Just as many things that we think of purely as an emotion or an attitude, they are action words. Faith is an action word. Love is an action word in that there's a verb part of that word, is that we must make the choice to exhibit love through how we act, through our actions, to exhibit our faith through how we act. And going back specifically to love, it's a choice. And Larry brought that up as well, that it's not just suddenly this emotion that we put on. It's a choice that we have to love, because emotions are extremely fickle. All right, waking up, in the morning because shivering because somebody took all the blankets that night. Love might be an emotion that's a little bit fleeting at 6 a.m. when you're freezing. But it's a choice. It's not always the emotion. It's that choice to have love for one another. The choice for the husband to love his wife and the wife to love her husband. And ending in verse 33. Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. There is both sides of this relationship that play out for both the husband and for the wife. He makes his point, Paul makes his point of what the church is supposed to be, or rather the relationship between Christ and the church, and he ends this chapter with, nevertheless, each individual among you is to love his own wife, so on and so forth, as we read. I think we talked a lot about that. Any further comments before we end this chapter? Randy.
It's not a deal that two people make per se.
Mm-hmm.
It could be if we fulfill our part of the deal all the time.
Right.
But that's not the way, like I said, people have choices.
Yep.
And if you're constantly holding the other person responsible for his or her behavior, and based on that, then I will behave accordingly. And there are a lot of people I think that way. That if I'm doing my part, well then I should receive from my partner what he or she is supposed to do.
No, and that's a really good point, Randy, is that it's not a deal where I do what I'm supposed to do and therefore she does it too, or he does it too. And that's a point I think sometimes we overlook in a lot of things. You remind me of my own brain going places. Christ talks about with the golden rule, do unto others as you want done unto yourself. And there's almost an expectation we can have there is, okay, well, if I treat others the way I want to be treated, therefore they shall treat me right. It's not how reality works a lot of the times. Now, if we lived in a perfect world, it should work that way, but we don't. And oftentimes we have to remember that the responsibility always lies upon the individual first. Is that we have the responsibility to love another person. We have the responsibility to treat others as we want to be treated. We as individuals, as individual husbands, have the responsibility to love the wife. As individual wives have the responsibility to show respect and subjection and love to the husband. It's independent, as Randy brought up, of whether or not we're getting it in return, because the responsibility is upon the self. And we talked about this a few weeks ago when it came to forgiveness. We don't forgive because another person deserves it or asks for it. We forgive because that's what we are supposed to do as individuals for ourselves. And that goes the same for the relationships that we're talking about here. Dana, you had your hand up.
I just wanted to kind of bounce off of what Randy said with, in an ideal world, but in the real world, you find that people will wait for you to do what you're supposed to do before they have a responsibility to do what they're supposed to do. So it's kind of the flip of that. It's like,
Yeah.
I'm supposed to do this and then you'll do this, but I don't have to do this until you do your part.
Exactly. We think that there, again, like Randy said, and like you're saying, Dana, is there's a deal where, okay, you do what you're supposed to do, then I'll do what I'm supposed to do. And that's the exact opposite of what God expects from us. Because going back to a point made earlier, we can't control another person. The only person we can control is ourselves. And we can control if we're doing what we ought to be doing. And then that might encourage another person to do what they're supposed to do. And that's a good point, Dana. In an ideal world, that's the way it should be. But in the world, in reality, rather, it works almost in the exact opposite. Nolan?
I think when we have that expectation of reciprocation,
Yeah,
that's when we let ourselves down.
100%.
If you're doing it because you want to do it, you shouldn't expect the reciprocation. You just do it because you want to do it.
Yeah, and that then again goes to a point Mitch made earlier is, we're expecting something in return. And that's, in a way, putting ourselves first. We're not truly being self-sacrificial if we're expecting something in return, that it's reciprocal. That's a very good point, Nolan, that relationships are responsibilities. If we're doing them expecting something in return, there's a problem with an underlying heart and attitude and motivation. Exactly. Christ didn't expect anything from us when he went to the cross. He did it because he loved us, and then we make our choices according to the choice that Christ made. All right, just very quickly with the remaining time that we have, moving into chapter 6, we're once again going to be focusing on family relationships on the first part of this chapter. He sort of just continues the thought through the family unit and through the interaction of love and responsibility to one another. And we go from parents into children. Let's see. Scott Richards, would you mind reading verses 1 through 4, please?
Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you, and that you may live long on the earth. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord.
All right, thank you. So we're not going to have time this evening to fully unpack and digest that, but I wanted to again sort of tee this up. for next week. Well, next class. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. Something to think about. And we'll talk more about this next time. Is most of the people in here are not what we would call children in the worldly sense or in the societal sense, and that almost everyone here tonight is of the age that is considered an adult by our society, by our laws. But do we ever stop being a child? Is there an expiration on this idea of obeying one's parents and honoring father and mother? I want you to think about that as we go from this class to our next one for next time. Think about, is there an expiration date to this? And also look back, if you have the time and inclination, look at the 10 Commandments and verify Paul's point to see if he is correct, his supposition in verse 2 that it is the first commandment with a promise. And ask yourself, why? And what is that promise for? So, sort of twofold homework. Think about, I say homework very tongue-in-cheek. If you have time, look at the 10 Commandments. Ask yourself why maybe that's the first commandment with a promise, and if that's true, first of all. And secondly, think about if there is an expiration date to what we see in verses 1 through 3. So with that, we'll go ahead and end with a closing word of prayer. Let's see, Larry Enriquez, would you mind leading us in closing word of prayer?
Father in heaven, we thank you again so much for an opportunity to study your word. We pray, Father, that as many of us have spouses, that we take what we've learned this evening, realizing, Father, that everything that we do is in service to you, and help us to love our spouses in such a way that we love the church, like as you love the church. Again, Father, be with us throughout the week. Keep us safe from harm. Be with the Robinsons and help them during this struggle. This is our prayer in your Son's beloved name.